Hi, my name is Neeltje Van Horen. I'm Professor of Financial Economics at the University of Amsterdam and Senior Research Advisor at the Bank of England. And I'll be talking today about the importance of cash for investment of SMEs during and after a financial crisis. Well, in many countries, SMEs are very important to the economy. They hold the largest share of employment and output, and they also often are the drivers of innovation and growth. However, SMEs are also often very much affected by crises, such as the global financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, and more recently, the COVID shock. And there are several reasons for that. One reason is that SMEs tend to be less diversified, and it's much harder for them to downsize, and that makes them vulnerable to sudden drops in demand, as we normally observe during a crisis. Another reason is that banks tend to reduce lending much more to SMEs compared to large firms when a financial crisis hits. And the reason for that is that lending to SMEs tend to be more risky because these firms require more screening and monitoring. And when that happened, SMEs do not really have an option to go to other sources of external funding and need to, as a result, rely on their internal funds, their cash, instead. So this suggests that for SMEs, cash is very important, or could be a very important determinant as how these firms survive a crisis and how quickly they can recover after the economy starts to recover as well. So we study this question with two of my colleagues at the Bank of England, Andy Joseph and Christiana Kneer. What we want to see is whether UK SMEs, after and during the financial crisis, how they invested and how much that was determined by the cash holdings that these firms had at the onset of the crisis. So what we first look at what the impact was on having cash when the financial crisis started on their investment behavior during the crisis itself. And what we observe is that SMEs that had ample cash on their balance sheet, so this is what we call the cash-rich SMEs, that we find that these firms did not reduce their fixed asset, they did not reduce their capital stock. What that means is that these firms, when their machines were depreciating or their computers, they could replace them. Their cash-poor rivals, however, they had to reduce their fixed assets. They could not replace machines that went broke or replace old computers, and had instead to resort to a lower capital stock during the crisis. And there are several reasons that can explain that. One is that firms that were cash-rich going into the crisis, they had money when banks withdraw their funding to continue to invest, while cash-poor firms did not have that cash. A second reason is that for banks to even continue lending during the crisis, they were much more likely to do that for firms that had a lot of cash, because that entailed less risk for the bank. And the third reason is that we know that firms, when they're hit by a shock, they actually, with the money that they still earn, they put a larger share in as savings, and they won't invest that money in order to prevent being hit even more if the crisis worsens. So that's the first part that we document. However, then we go and look at the recovery period, and we observe that this positive effect of having cash on your balance sheet when a crisis hits does not stop after a crisis, but actually amplifies during the recovery. So what we see, or what we estimate, is that during the crisis period, so the investment between 2007 and 2009, we see that cash-rich firms, as I said, do hold their fixed assets constant, while cash-poor firms reduce them with 5 percentage points. However, when we take the recovery period into account, when we look at the total investment over the period 2007 to 2014, we see that cash-rich firms actually increase their fixed assets with 5 percentage points, while their cash poor rivals reduce theirs with 6.6%. So they even reduce it further during the recovery period. So what we see is that there is an investment gap that opens during the crisis, and that investment gap becomes bigger, it more than doubles during the recovery period. So then you can think like, okay, well, maybe this is always how this relationship between cash and investment holds. So what we do is then we compare this with what we call a triangular normal period before the financial crisis. And we see that actually the relationship between cash and investment is very different. We do observe a slightly higher investment at the short term during normal times between cash-rich and cash-poor firms. But we do not observe in the longer run, over a course of 6 years, we do not observe a different effect. So that shows that the effect of cash on firm investment is very different during after a financial crisis and a recovery. So we then also observe that the effect is much stronger for young and small SMEs, and that makes perfect sense because these SMEs tend to be more affected by a crisis, and banks tend to pull away credit more from younger and smaller firms. So then, of course, the question is what drives this? What drives this increase or amplification of the investment gap during the recovery period? And we document two mechanisms that are behind this. One is a competition effect. So as you recall, the cash-rich SMEs, they could maintain their fixed assets, so they could maintain their capital stock, while their cash-poor rivals had to reduce theirs. So that means that the productive capacity of the cash-rich firms stayed on top, while that of the cash-poor ones diminished. But when the recovery sets in and demand returns to the market, then the cash-rich firms have ample productive capacity to meet this demand. They can generate more earnings, and they can use these earnings to invest more. However, the cash-poor rivals do not have these earnings. They don't have the productive capacity. They can't meet demand. They don't have these earnings, and therefore they can't invest more and even have to reduce their fixed assets. And indeed, when we look at the market share and the profits of cash-rich versus cash-poor SMEs, we see that the cash-rich increase their market share and have higher profits both during the crisis and even more so during the recovery period relative to their cash-poor peers. And this effect holds within small industry. So it's like comparing different types of restaurants, and you see that the cash-rich restaurant can just increase its market share and generate more profit than its cash-poor rival. A second mechanism that we document has to do with borrowing constraints. So during the financial crisis, banks reduced their borrowing significantly. They will be more likely to continue borrowing to firms that still have a lot of cash. Then when the recovery sets in, we do see that banks return, they are more willing to lend, credit conditions improve. However, banks are also weakened by the financial crisis, plus they have to face more stricter regulation. So banks will be more picky who they continue to lending to, and they're much more likely to continue lending to cash-rich firms who were able to generate more income during the crisis and who were also able to maintain their fixed assets while their cash-poor firms couldn't, had to reduce theirs. So the cash-rich firms have more collateral to pledge at the bank. And indeed, we find that both during the crisis and even more so after the recovery, we see that cash-poor firms have to reduce their levels of debt while the cash-rich firms can increase them. So what we show is that cash matters a lot for investment during a crisis. As economists, we often think about the debt side of a firm's balance sheet, and there is quite a lot of research that shows that indeed firms with high levels of debt have a hard time getting through a crisis and also through a recovery period. But what we show is that it's not only debt that matters, it's the asset side, how much cash a firm has that has very important implications for how easy it is for a firm to get through a crisis and to even flourish afterwards. So these results also, as we show that firms who do not have cash actually reduce their productive capacity, that provides incentives for governments to provide liquidity quickly to firms when a crisis hits. And that's in order to prevent these firms to having to reduce their productive capacity. And that's exactly what we saw happening during the COVID crisis.